I am the Vice President of Programs and Advocacy at the Schott Foundation for Public Education. I'd like to welcome everyone to this webinar today entitled Strategies for Lifting All Children Up, which is a part of an ongoing grassroots education series coordinated by the Foundation. The Schott Foundation, if you're not familiar, is a national philanthropic organization. We focus on educational opportunity, healthy living learning communities, and community-led change. We hope to accelerate advocacy by supporting local, state, and national campaigns that are working to close the opportunity gap faced by low-income and children of color in the United States. To learn more about the Schott Foundation, please visit our website at www.schottfoundation.org. We invite you today to follow our conversation on Twitter using the hashtag grassrootsed. Again, that's hashtag grassrootsed. And throughout the conversation, feel free to tweet questions to Schott Foundation. The handle is at Schott, S-C-H-O-T-T, found, F-O-U-N-D, or type them into the chat box on your screen. We will be recording this webinar today for your future viewing pleasure. And also, you should know that at the end, we'll open up for about 20 minutes of questions and answers with our guest presenters today at the end of the discussion. Today's Grassroots Education series will cover some of the problems of equity in public education, point to research-based policy solutions, and highlight lessons from the successful work of grassroots community-based organizations like Californians for Justice, who organize to make these solutions real for every child. Now, without further delay, I'd like to welcome our featured guest speakers today. We have with us Kevin Wellner, who is the Director of the National Education Policy Center at the University of Colorado, and Taryn Ishida, who is Executive Director of Californians for Justice. Kevin and Taryn, welcome.
Thank you.
So you all, we'll start out with some introductions if you want to share a little bit more about who you are, your organizations, and and then we'll jump into some conversation.
Sure. Taryn, do you want to start?
Sure. My name is Taryn Ishida. I'm the Executive Director of Californians for Justice. You can guess we're in California from our name. We are a statewide grassroots organization that really puts students themselves at the center of our work. We believe that young people are actually the leaders we need to solve some of our toughest issues, both in education and in our communities. So we have 4 offices around the state of California, and we organize education justice campaigns and do a lot of movement building work with some of the great organizations that are in California.
Thank you. I'm the Executive Director of the National Education Policy Center, and we're headquartered housed at University of Colorado Boulder. NEPC is designed to provide resources and assistance to try to work with faculty at universities around the country and to some extent around the world who wish to bring their research knowledge beyond the bounds of speaking to one another as academics through books and peer-reviewed journal articles, and extend that to speaking to a broader public to try to bring the research base into broader public discussions. Our website is nepc.colorado.edu.
Thanks, Taryn. Thanks, Kevin. So to kick off our conversation today, I have a question for you. We often blame schools for all of the problems in education today, right? So problems of inequity, we know, cannot really just be blamed on what's happening within public schools, but they also stem from larger structural issues in the community, like unemployment, poverty, housing, and disinvestment of public resources. What have you found to be a useful framework to understand and act on these issues?
I'm not sure which one of us is jumping in first. Let me this time around, I'll speak about the infographic that NEPC did along with the Schott Foundation. This is, I think, about 2 months ago, 3 months ago. We worked with the Schott Foundation to turn one of the NEPC publications into an infographic that discusses this exact issue. And I think the starting point here, and really where every discussion of this type must begin, is the opportunity gap. Kids who live in low-income areas usually are facing twin disadvantages: fewer opportunities to learn within schools, and fewer such resources outside of schools. One other broad point worth mentioning up front is that the nation's excessive focus on measuring outcomes and demanding improvement is out of balance. For more than 2 decades, even predating NCLB, education policy and school improvement efforts have given short shrift to capacity building and to resources. And it's certainly useful to collect outcome information as part of a healthy feedback loop to understand what needs to be done. But we've been relying on high-stakes testing to actually be our main reform tool to drive what goes on in schools. So where are we as a nation? We've measured achievement gaps and we've demanded that they increase, but we haven't yet taken the next step. We haven't turned to well-established research evidence that explains how achievement gaps arise and how they can be closed. If we expect to make any real progress, we need to balance the measurement of outcomes with a strong attention to inputs and to opportunity gaps. The overall opportunity gap is the result of a compilation, a cumulative effect of many separate obstacles. So a child without high-quality preschool, for example, faces even greater obstacles if she's also without good health and dental care, if her parents have no stable employment, if their housing situation is unsure and transient and segregated, if her school has inexperienced and poorly trained teachers who themselves are unlikely to remain at the school for long, if the intervention required for low test scores at her school hinges on these turnaround approaches that result in even more churn, if her school faces overcrowding and serious maintenance issues, if technology and learning materials are spotty and outdated, if she's shunted into dead-end, low-track classes that evidence a soft bigotry of low expectations, if educators and others do not understand her family's cultural and linguistic background and assume that these are deficits that cannot be built upon, if her neighborhood school is not safe or has few enrichment opportunities after school and over the summer, and on, right? Responsible policymakers cannot avoid the reality that closing the achievement gap means seriously addressing these multiple obstacles. So when we hear political candidates say that they will close the opportunity gap, what do they mean? How will a proposed policy actually increase opportunities to learn? There are some good examples out there of current policy initiatives that research suggests will help. Things like high-quality early childhood education and free, full-service community schools with wraparound supports. But even these must be understood as partial measures. So the infographic that Schott did with us illustrates that opportunity gaps can be addressed at the school level or at the broader societal level. But in truth, this must be both and, not either or. Unequal opportunities and resources within a school are a huge problem. But research evidence overwhelmingly tells us that we cannot create obstacle after obstacle for students and then ask schools to overcome the damage that we've done. Let's turn this over to Taryn.
Great, thank you, Kevin. Yeah, I think the both and is definitely the framework that Californians for Justice and so many other groups who are trying to address deeper systemic issues are realizing we have to take, as challenging as that can be. One just doesn't work without the other. And so I love this infographic that Schott has put out. I think the simple answer for Californians for Justice is, because we are an organizing group, we work directly with young folks. our simplest explanation of a framework is just to look through the eyes of our young folks themselves. If we know that the youth and the families that we work with, their lives are not neatly separated into two boxes. Unfortunately, like the infographic, it's not just in school and out of school for them. Those lines are completely blurred between, challenges that they deal with their own identity, as well as issues in their home and their community. So I wanted to just kind of give you a picture of, one of the stories that our young person I work with shared actually at a State Board of Education meeting. So if everyone on the webinar can just kind of just pause and maybe close your eyes. This is exactly the story that Sky Lowe, who's now 17 years old, shared a few months ago. He said, "Imagine that you are 16 years old. It's only Tuesday, and you have $10. You sit there and you decide. You make hard choices. Is it bus money to go to school, or is it laundry detergent for clean clothes? You see, my mother lost her job." You can open your eyes if you close them. But basically, what Sky shared is that at 16 years old, he took up the responsibility of supporting himself, having to choose between school supplies or shampoo or food. He missed a ton of school. He was on the verge of being disenrolled in the Oakland high school that he attended. And this really kind of this instability stemmed from his mother first losing her job and then being unable to pay for rent. As we all know, housing prices are going up all around the country, and particularly in Oakland, in the Bay Area, there's been a ton of displacement for young people and families of color. So I think this story is just meant to illustrate how intersectional, these issues are. Things that affect his achievement and the opportunities that he has to learn are directly impacted by his home situation and what his mother was struggling with. I want to just kind of focus on the framework that a lot of groups, organizing groups, take when we think about intersectional work with education and things outside of our schools, and just highlight 3 ways that we find it helpful to think about this. The how is often the trickiest part, and so for us, we do it, number 1, with our base. So the picture here kind of illustrates Sky, who we do a lot of political education, with the members of our organization, and we make sure we've been working to kind of improve the intersectional political education we provide. So literally, our workshop series starts with issues of racial justice. The second topic we tackle is economics. The third is gender and sexuality. And then the fourth is education. So we do it in that order and in that sequence because young folks and our members really need to understand how their identity ties to the issues in education policy. Second is our campaigns, and so this is where the bulk of our work, happens. We're working on policy campaigns, like the current campaign that our young folks have launched is called Believe in Me, and it's basically trying to tackle one of the systemic issues of young folks being undervalued, stereotyped, and not seen as a holistic person. So the picture with the masks that you see there are them kind of talking to legislators and decision makers, saying that they just feel like statistics. They're being treated like numbers rather than human beings as holistic people. And this is not an issue that's isolated to education, right? We see this in the police brutality happening around the country, in the job and wage discrimination that we're seeing across the country. So that is not, an issue that just lives only in our schools. And the last thing I want to share is this picture at the bottom just represents none of our organizations can do any of this work alone. We can't address income inequality. We can't address the educational injustice that we see. And so we, at the core of our work, are really building strategic alliances. And so the example in this picture is we worked with a number of Oakland organizations like Oakland Community Organization, Casa Justa, to work on issues like housing, like the minimum wage, like criminal justice, and LGBTQ justice. And so through that work, we don't have to know about every single issue or be experts on every single issue, but through our alliances and our partnerships, we're able to bridge the things that all of our young people experience, both in school and out of school.
Thank you. I was wondering if you two could both speak to some of the challenges of this approach. I think that when you think of attempting to tackle problems within school, but also system inequalities, what are the realistic challenges with that approach?
Yeah.
Kevin?
Sure, I'll jump in. The researchers are to point out, and we should, that the measured achievement gap is, as best we can tell, due to outside of school factors twice as much as inside school factors. That's why so many of us scream and holler about the importance of addressing poverty and racism. But it's also important to note that this research only looks at how much of the variance in measured school outcomes is accounted for by differences among our current schools. For the most part, the research does not address how much of the achievement gap could be closed if we somehow were to provide the abundance of resources and opportunities in schools that would meaningfully close opportunity gaps. And this is important. We don't know because we've never really tried the school-centric approach. Going back to the infographic, this sort of the bottom left part of the overall infographic that talks about school-centric approaches. What we have tried at the school level is far too weak to make much of a difference. Of course, a school serving an under-resourced community won't close achievement gaps if the school has the same or fewer resources as the comparison school in a wealthy community. If we were to take the school-centric approach seriously, it would require doing all or almost all of the things in this infographic, and probably more. And even then, I would not bet on this overcoming the cumulative impact of poverty and racism. So real reform is not easy. It would be hugely naive to think it is easy. But, and this is the key, it is also naive to think that these sort of deep, sustained difficulties and obstacles that are faced by kids do not require the sort of deep, sustained reform that we're talking about here. This sort of deep, sustained reform is necessary, and it's naive to think in terms of silver bullets and magic beans. You know, if we just had merit pay, or if we just demanded full proficiency by 2014, or if we just turned school management over to so-called high-quality charter schools, right? Even the specific research-based reforms listed in this infographic will do little in isolation. For example, detracking our schools. I've done a lot of work in the area of tracking and racial tracking, and I've advocated strongly for detracking our schools. And detracking our schools makes sense for reasons of equity and educational improvement. But those detracked classes still won't be particularly successful without supported, experienced teachers, without small class sizes, without high-quality preschool and other interventions and supports, et cetera, right? There are no quick fixes. And I would say that understanding that and approaching reform with that understanding and the need for this sort of deep, sustained reform is really our main challenge.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. I think the first challenge that comes to mind is just the practical, everyday, you know, there's only so many hours in the day. And to take on multiple issues, there's already so many just within the education sphere, but then to also try to think about housing and jobs and wages and zoning, you know, you can feel overwhelmed. And on a very practical level, being able to do that as an organization, in our case, we only have 18 staff, and we can only do so many things in a given day. So the challenge really is around capacity, and I think a couple of things this plays out in how deep you're able to go with your base or your membership around the issue itself. It's navigating multiple decision-making systems. So the housing authority, transportation authority, school board, city council, that's a challenge. And then also funders. I think if there are any funders on this call, so many of the funding that comes to community organizing is very issue specific. And so if you aren't just working on healthy food, you can't really take on criminal justice or policing. That is also a big issue in your backyard. So, a shout out to Schott Foundation, who is not who does have a really holistic approach to tackling issues. The other two challenges I'll just touch on very briefly are, I think a lot of folks who are on the ground know that the immediate needs that the young folks or the families you're working with can often feel the most urgent, right? So how can you think about these long-term systemic issues like redistricting when you have, like, I don't have a house, I don't have a job, I don't have a desk, I don't have a textbook. Those things feel like really urgent and immediate needs. And so being able to balance those two things out, the long-term gain as well as, the things that are right in front of your face is a big challenge for all of us. And then lastly, this is something I think as a movement we don't talk about enough, but we all know that perception and beliefs are one of the underlying problems of the systemic racism that exists in all of our communities. And so what I mean by that is even when we pass great policies like college for all, it doesn't change the people in the system who still carry a lot of stereotypes, implicit and explicit bias that can counteract the policies for equity and justice. And just a quick example is Governor Brown, who's the current governor of California. He was the champion of some of the biggest school reforms we've had here, and yet he's been quoted saying that even though that reform was really powerful, let's not expect that it will actually close the achievement gap, right? So that inherent belief that sometimes problems are just always going to be there, like the achievement gap, is a big challenge that we have to be conscious of.
Absolutely. I want to remind our listeners, if you have questions that are coming up for you for the discussion, feel free to put those in the chat box. Also, we realize that Twitter, the actual Twitter site, has been down for most of this conversation. It is back up now, so if you want to tweet and using the hashtag grassrootsed, we can see your questions there as well. Our next question for you guys, let's talk about solutions. So these problems seem very overwhelming, and you guys address some of the realities of that. But in terms of solutions that you see working, in policy and organizing to resolve these problems, we would love to hear your thoughts there, as well as what are some of the best strategies to actually implement these solutions.
Mm-hmm.
Want to start, Kevin?
Sure. Well, what I just left off saying was that these things are very that quick solutions are not possible and should be avoided. Attempts to look for the silver bullet tend to do harm. And I would say the first part of a solution is first do no harm. Stop destabilizing the system. Stop chasing the shiny objects, and understand that we really need to recognize the hurdles and engage in the sort of deep, sustained reform that's necessary to address poverty and racism and other hurdles that these kids are constantly encountering. We have at CU Boulder, as part of the National Education Policy Center, we just started a project last year called the Schools of Opportunity Project. If you go to opportunitygap.org, that's the website of the project. And we just will be announcing in September a series of schools around the country who, these schools are doing almost everything that they can. These are high schools that we're focused on, public high schools. And these are schools that we should be constantly praising and emulating. These are schools that are closing opportunity gaps. And I truly believe that they are making an enormous difference for their students. But if we look at the results of these schools, then I think that we will find that the main predictors of outcomes will still almost surely be parental wealth and formal education. That is for a half a century, we've been doing research study after research study and constantly finding that we can predict the outcome, particularly of test score measures. We can predict the outcome on average by looking at the child's family, looking at the parental wealth and formal education. And that link is found worldwide, but it's much stronger here than in places like Finland, where there are the sort of supports and opportunities to learn that are sort of wrapped around the student in so many ways, and make the opportunity gap much lesser for these kids.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you.
Great. Yeah, I'm excited that this webinar is really focusing on solutions. I think it's just easy to get trapped in the challenges. So just want to thank folks for making that the center of this conversation. I want to highlight kind of 4 things that we've seen working in our work in California, and then talk a little bit about some of the strategies about how you go about actually doing all of this. So the 4 solutions are equitable school funding, holistic interventions like social emotional learning and community schools. The third is around looking at affordable housing, and the 4th is around actually looking at the criminal justice system. So the first example, equitable funding, this is a really powerful thing that's happening across the country. It directly addresses the opportunity gap, and in California we were able to pass a new pretty historic reform called local control funding formula. And what that did was it changed the way the state gives money out to school districts by basing the money on the type of students the district is serving. So if a district, for every low income English learner or foster care youth, a district will get additional money. And every time the district has a high concentration of those same students, they get a third pot of money. So this was huge, right? It took actually 10 years of students and parents being at the forefront of going to the Capitol, going to the governor, and demanding a more fair school funding formula. Really at the heart of California's challenges is Proposition 13, and we still need to dismantle that. That's what's led to really inequitable funding. The second, I think, promising solution is around social emotional learning. It's something that our young folks have really lifted up, kind of back to that idea of being treated as whole people. We're not just test takers. We're not just focused on passing, getting good grades. A big challenge for them is really dealing with all of the other side of things, the social and emotional well-being, like how do you deal with being homeless and your mother losing their job and that instability. So I think that's something really promising that we're seeing bright spots in California starting to take form. The third is just to kind of call out some of the great work that our ally organizations are doing around housing and affordable housing. Housing Long Beach, Working Partnerships in San Jose, Casa Justa in the Bay Area are really some of the organizations at the forefront of addressing renters' rights and affordable housing. I think we all know this can affect the families, right, that attend our schools, but something that we don't often think about are the teachers and the school staff. So right now in Oakland, for example, not only do we have one of the worst teacher shortages that we've had in years, but on top of that, teachers cannot afford to live in Oakland. So the majority of them actually are commuting in an hour and a half to school, which means it's harder to attract quality teachers, it's harder to retain them. And for the students themselves, they're losing out on those informal hours with their teachers as club advisors or things that often happen for teachers to build relationships with students. So affordable housing is a really key thing that we want to highlight as a critical solution. And the last one is if you haven't heard about Proposition 47 in California, I think this is a really great example of looking at a system like the criminal justice system and being able to think about how do we take the money from getting folks kind of out of prisons back into their communities and reinvest that money, that savings from the prison system, back into mental health, community services, and schools. So that was a huge thing that happened in 2014 in California, and it's sending millions of dollars from the criminal justice system back into mental health services and education. I want to end with just some of the ways to go about doing this. I know when I'm on webinars like this, I often feel like, great, I'm inspired, but how? How do I take action? And so I think some of the things we wanted to lift up are, number one, if you take anything away, it's just, please make sure that the people most impacted from these challenges, from these problems, are leading the solutions, right? So our young people, our parents, our families, our teachers, they really should be the ones at the forefront of any solution that you tackle. Number two, civic engagement. So electoral organizing is a really great way that if you can't work on housing all year round or the minimum wage all year round, during just a couple months leading up to elections, it allows you to really tackle things like Proposition 47 or affordable housing. The third is really the last one, and this is just kind of thinking about yourself joining multi-issue coalitions. So some examples are Bay Area Equal Voices, which is supported by the Margaret Casey Foundation. We have groups that do economic justice, addressing the school-to-prison pipeline and criminal justice, affordable housing, living wage, etc. Because those groups all have such different expertise, and because Californians for Justice is at the table, that's what has led to things like Proposition 47 or bigger kind of coalition efforts taking on things like development and displacement in the Bay Area. So I would say that's another great way for folks to kind of take action.
Mm-hmm. That's very helpful. We are beginning to get some questions coming in, but I want to allow our participants here, our speakers, to sort of make any closing statements that you want to make. If there's one really key takeaway from this conversation today that you want the audience to take with them, what would that be? Kevin, we'll start with you.
Sure. Well, I'll start off by amplifying what Taryn just said, which is that I think that going back to the solution discussion, that there really is this siloing that we sometimes get into. If you're a community organizer, then you think that all the solutions have to be through community organizing. If you're a researcher, you think that all the researchers have to be through community organizing, etc. A lawyer looking at lawsuits. And in truth, all of these things are important, and it's really important for us to get out of our silos and work with one another. To share ideas, to understand, for researchers, and I'll speak from my own position, for researchers to work with people in communities, to work with attorneys, to work with other researchers in other fields, and get a much better understanding of what the lived experiences are in those different realms. So I would amplify that. In terms of one takeaway, I think it's that children, like all people, learn when they have opportunities to learn. And the richer those opportunities, the more learning. It's pretty straightforward. And when those opportunities are denied, we get very predictable achievement gaps. And measuring those achievement gaps again and again won't close the opportunity gaps. So again, there are no quick fixes. And instead, we should be looking to sound policies that are based on good evidence. And we should be wary of approaches that are poorly thought out and poorly supported. Real school improvement depends on turning to these evidence-based policies and then backing them with sustained support that they're going to need in order to bear fruit.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, my one takeaway would just be take action. Find something you can do tomorrow. If it's, there's a spectrum of things. A very simple thing could just be examining your own work, looking at the information that Kevin has put out there and asking yourself, are we doing what we need to do to really address the systemic issues we want to achieve? Another simple action step you could take is go out and canvass this election season. Go out one time, go out 4 times, whatever you can do. Um, Go out, try to train your members, do a political education on a topic that you wouldn't normally tackle, like gender justice or income inequality. And then lastly, think about finding a coalition of groups that are working outside of your issue area. So if you're an education group, find some organizations that are working on immigration or housing that you can team up with. I think that would be it. Just take action, find something small or big that you can do.
Thank you. So we're going to take some questions from our participants now. Thanks, everyone. Feel free to keep the questions coming in. The first question is, maybe Kevin, this is directed at you. How do we ensure that this valuable type of research that is really looking at children kind of with a whole child approach gets into the hands of policymakers and folks who and advocates who are really in a position to influence how resources are allocated and decisions are made around some of these reforms?
Mm-hmm. That's an excellent question. I mean, I mentioned the policy center that I direct is designed to address that, and I sometimes describe it as if you think about the way that researchers work, is we tend to have one audience, we tend to have one conversation among scholars, right? So we go to conferences, we write books, we publish in publications that a few other researchers and maybe our parents read, right? And we get that knowledge building conversation that can actually be extremely valuable, and without it we really wouldn't have much in terms of evidence building. But all the while, the issues that we're discussing amongst ourselves are also being discussed in a parallel conversation. And in that parallel conversation is almost everyone else. It's policymakers, it's media, it's attorneys, it's people in the communities. And for the most part, those conversations just go along parallel to one another and not really cross-fertilizing. You certainly have people in the second conversation reaching over into the first one and cherry-picking a study or two to support pre-existing ideas, or you might have someone run a Google search and the first result that comes up is the proof of whatever it is, right? But there isn't really a healthy way that research is brought into the second conversation, such that the overall research base, the overall finding of social science research is understood and used. And one of the core things that we understand within the research community is that it's not about one study. Every study has limitations. So it's about building an overall research base based on the overall high quality studies that have been done in a given area. The other thing that is really important to understand is that there are groups all around the country that have been, they're modeled mainly on the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C., but a lot of them are at the state level, that are devoted completely to bringing research into that second conversation, the overall conversation. But it's not about research, it's about communication. It's about, for these groups, it's about finding a way to coat an advocacy document with a research veneer and then pushing it into the second conversation. And that's a particularly dangerous thing because people are constantly saying now, well, research can be made to say anything. And in truth, well, that is true. Research can be made to say anything. High quality research cannot be made to say anything. And drawing that distinction and having people in research institutions, like the one I work in and research institutions that exist in every state, having people in those research institutions working with the same sorts of communication mechanisms and the same sort of devotion to bringing research into the public conversation and helping people to become not just scholars but public scholars. That I think is the change that has to be made in answer to the question. In other words, I think that there has to be a support structure, an incentive structure, so that people who are the true experts in a given area about early childhood education or class size reduction or teacher teacher experience and things like that, that is a true benefit and of, how do I put it? If we are to invest so much in a knowledge building exercise, getting the true benefit out of that will require us helping people to become public scholars and bring that information into the larger public conversation.
Thank you. Taryn, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I thought that was a great answer.
All right, great. We have several educators with us today getting questions from teachers. Some are asking what they can do in their classrooms to address issues such as language gaps to help children get on a grade level. And are teachers supposed to think about these issues as part of a broader community strategy? Any thoughts about that question?
I think that's a hard one. You know, I'm not a practitioner, and I would say, I guess my thought about language gaps in particular is that, you know, kind of back to the meat of this conversation, which is nothing is in isolation, and so, again, like thinking about who your constituents are, your parents and your students themselves, understanding what they need is always the first step as a really great teacher and educator. What is it that's holding them back? I know that I've had some really great conversations with students who are former English language learners, and they can pick out the programs or the kind of activities they did in classrooms that made the biggest difference for them. And a lot of those have been cut, right, unfortunately, through budget cut years. But again, kind of back to the idea that sometimes the solutions are right in front of you from the students and parents you know. And then outside of the classroom, there's been a really great movement around bringing back bilingual education. So I would definitely look in your community and see how you can work on that outside of your classroom.
So I would agree with that. I'll add that, you know, the Schools of Opportunity project that we have, one of the 11 criteria that we look at for schools, and this doesn't apply to every high school, of course, but for high schools that are serving students for whom English is not their first language, there we are. The second to last item there is build on the strengths of language minority students and correctly identify their needs. I would add to that, here this is selection criteria for a given high school. I think the broader question also involves state leaders and federal leaders in terms of providing the resources necessary to do this well. So I would be willing to bet that those people who Taryn is talking about, who I could identify the experiences that they found to be particularly valuable, that those experiences were ones where the classroom teacher was building on their strengths, was valuing their own experiences and building on those experiences. And we have in this country, and this is not true in other countries, but in this country we have politicized language to an extreme extent. And certainly in California, but also in several other states, Arizona, Massachusetts, we have had the public weigh in on how kids should be taught, how emerging bilingual students are, whether people should be considered to be emerging bilingual students if they are, if English isn't their first language. And instead of it being a professional determination made by educators, it's a political determination. So I would say if we back away from that, change it more to a professional decision made by educators, and provide the supports necessary for the teachers and the students to build on those strengths, we have a tremendous asset that we have been squandering that we can develop.
Absolutely. Related, there's a question from around teachers, maybe looking at teacher unions. And do either of you have experience through either research or policy or in your organizing work working with unions that adopted a broader scope of policy change and then, you know, to their agenda, such as minimum wage, that type of thing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm really glad someone asked this question. I think um, our unions and our teachers' unions in particular are just such an amazing opportunity to really tackle some of these deep systemic issues that affect our schools. I think as an example, I know at one of the Schott Foundation conferences, I met a lot of folks from Chicago teachers unions who have really adopted a very holistic agenda as a policy agenda that tackled things like minimum wage, but early childhood education, et cetera. And they really worked in partnership with community organizing groups to kind of form that so that it would be their issue platform would be informed by what people were seeing as the biggest needs in their community. I also want to just say that the thing that we've had a long history at Californians for Justice. We're working with the different local teacher unions in our areas as well as the state level, the California Teachers Association, CTA. And I think the thing that all of us are trying to do through conversations like today is to go from being really transactional partners, community with unions, to being much more transformational. So having a deeper relationship with each other that goes beyond just, I'll turn out when teachers are under attack with budget cuts, and then you'll turn out when we're trying to work on a minimum wage increase. But really going beyond that to seeing ourselves as true partners in this movement for justice and equity.
That's great. Kevin, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, we've done some work with the national teachers unions on a variety of things, including we did a policy brief called Safe at School, which was focused on LGBTQ students and policies that I know that the NEA in particular, but probably also the AFT, have been involved in that issue even before we were working with them on it. And I believe there are other issues that the questioner is sort of focused on that would be also things that these unions have been also working on. And of course, the union structure is you have a local, you have state affiliations, and then you have the national unions. And there's going to be a lot of variation among those. But I think that the core of what unions are called upon to do and paid by their members to do is bargaining about working conditions and pay and things like that. But they're clearly involved beyond that. NEPC, the organization that I direct, gets support primarily from the NEA, but also to some extent from the AFT. And I know that in our workings with them, they are also very invested in this idea of understanding what the research says and having, within the broad goal of strengthening public schools, having research drive the specifics of achieving that goal.
Thank you. We have so many more questions, so we probably will not be able to get to everyone today. I'm sorry, but let's try to squeeze in maybe two more. Someone asked a question about is working with those most impacted by these issues, and I'm going to assume that that's young people, students, parents, and the community. Is working directly with those folks a more effective way to address these issues? Or how do we engage those folks in this fight might be another way to pose that question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that it is ineffective. I won't claim to Kevin's point earlier about research feeling like research is the only way and organizing feeling like organizing is the only way. I do think it's a value. I think it's a value, so whether you're a researcher or you're a legislator or a policy advocate, that one of your values should be to talk to folks most impacted and really ground yourself authentically in what they're experiencing. Don't speak for them, I think that's just a value that all of us, I would hope, will carry and aspire to. In terms of how to go about doing it, there's a lot of great organizations in community who work every single day with students and families and parents. And so like Kevin pointed out earlier, we are so siloed. I live in a really small community, and I know that there's a great parent organization who has never talked to the teachers union across the street, and so those things, those silos need to be broken down intentionally. Building those bridges, reaching out, going to coffee with somebody, really simple stuff, I think is a good first step. So if you don't already work with a base of people, look for an organization that does. If that isn't a possibility for you, think about forming an advisory committee. That's a good first step, a good light touch way of doing it as a first step, and then see where you can go from there. Oftentimes I see people forming advisory committees. Actually, one of the districts we work with formed an advisory committee of students and parents, and what they did in year 2 was actually let those students and parents lead their own advisory committee rather than having district staff lead it. So I think over time you can kind of take one step at a time to get to the point where you will have a base of folks most impacted who can actually lead your campaigns.
Mm-hmm.
So I would agree with all of that, and just add that I don't think, even beyond the question of effectiveness, I think there's a question of democracy. There's a question of voice, and there's a question of just how we as a country and we as a society and we as a community think decisions should be made. The president last night said something to the effect of, "We don't want to be ruled," right? We're in a democracy, and we are the idea of turning to a great leader who's going to impose policy upon us is inconsistent with who we are. And I would agree with that, and I would say also in the Deweyan sense, we're losing a chance to bring citizens into the world who see themselves as citizens, as people who can be actively engaged. And if even the best policy imposed from top down without having local voice is a problem.
Absolutely. Thank you. This will be our last question. We'll wrap up here. But the question is regarding data that drives school-centric and systemic reforms. And it says, what, if any, level of standardized testing do you see as optimal to provide comparative data to influence these reforms? So a question about testing. Any response to that one?
I could take first shot at this one. Oh, go ahead, Karen.
Go ahead.
Okay. So this is something I've researched and written about, so I figured I'd take a first shot at it. The idea of collecting outcome data, particularly test score data, should be fairly uncontroversial. That there is a use for testing students, and not just for their individual grades or whatever, but also for informing the system. And getting that information in disaggregated sense, or in using it for other purposes, and analyzing it in different ways to understand how well the system has worked. That's a sensible use of data, and it's a sensible way to run a system. It's basically what I called earlier an evaluative feedback loop. That we can't make good decisions about how well a system is running without looking at the outcomes of that system. But that's not where we've been. That's not where we're currently heading even. Where we've been and where we're heading is to use tests as a driver of reform. To say to schools, your goal is not so much to educate kids as to show us you're educating kids by getting these test scores. And what that does is it displaces the goal from education to test scores. And what you then have is a set of incentives that says, okay, well, if we're going to be tested on English and math, let's squeeze out the science and social studies and PE and music, right? Or if we're going to be showing knowledge of math through this particular type of test, or not showing knowledge of language arts through this particular type of test, then we have to teach kids to learn and to demonstrate their knowledge in this particular way. So we're narrowing and we're squeezing out, and then we're also creating incentives for things like cheating, of course, if we attach high enough stakes to these things. That's the problem with the testing. It's not so much that the tests are inaccurate. They certainly have an error in them. It's not that the tests themselves are so narrow. If they were just used as part of an evaluative feedback loop, that could be understood and taken into account. The problem is how we're using them, not what they are.
Yeah. I do want to say that this kind of ties into a lot of the state accountability work that Californians for Justice has been doing for the past year in California. You know, the thing that I think we know doesn't work is over reliance on testing, as Kevin just pointed out. And so what we really pushed for from the grassroots level is a multiple measure system, one that actually looks at school climate, looks at opportunities to learn, that opportunity gap, like qualified teachers, facilities that actually provide textbooks and desks and bathrooms that are usable. So a range of measures that we know, and I'll tell you how we landed on it, because we didn't ask about testing directly. We asked our students and parents, what makes a good school? And I think when you ask that question and you come from that voice, people will tell you things like they'll talk about discipline and a safe culture and teachers that are prepared, that are qualified in their subjects, etc. So I do want to actually firmly say that there's a narrative out there. There's been some negative press around the idea of a multiple measures system for schools, measuring schools and for measuring state accountability. And I think we just firmly believe, just from this conversation, we know what it takes for young folks, especially young folks of color and low-income communities, to succeed. And it requires a more holistic approach than just testing.
Great, thank you. Well, we are out of time, and I want to thank our speakers today. Thank you, Taryn. Thank you, Kevin, so much for making the time and sharing your work with us. For all of our participants today, again, we will be sharing a recording of this as well as copies of the slides with you very soon. We would also like for you to take Taryn's advice in terms of taking action. And we can help you with that by asking you to join the National Opportunity to Learn Network that you can find on the Schott Foundation's website. That's www.schottfoundation.org. Again, thanks everyone for joining us today, and we look forward to talking with you again in the near future.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for listening.